Good afternoon and welcome to the Appeal Live. Or good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Appeal Live, unless you are watching us from Europe, in which case, good afternoon. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. So last week, voters in St. Louis elected Tishaura Jones as their new mayor. Now, Jones, a former state representative who's been serving as city treasurer since 2013, campaigned on a promise to lead St. Louis in a new direction, amid disappointment over outgoing Mayor Lyda Krewson's first and only term. Jones was particularly outspoken in her criticism of the criminal legal system's focus on policing and incarceration in St. Louis, as well as other racist systems that have historically disadvantaged residents of the city. Local advocates and activists have hailed Jones's victory as a chance to push St. Louis in a more progressive direction, not only by reforming those harmful systems, but hopefully by completely reimagining them. Joining me now to talk about Tishaura Jones's victory and what it means for St. Louis is the Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould, the Executive Director of the Missouri Faith Voices. Reverend Gould, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So Jones's win and inauguration next week seems to mark a sort of changing of the guard in St. Louis. She's already made history as the first Black woman to be elected mayor of St. Louis, which is a majority-minority city. And the two candidates who made it to the runoff were, in fact, the two most progressive candidates for office in the race. So for Jones in particular, her brand of politics marks a shift for the city. Can you talk about where the allegiances of St. Louis mayors have typically laid and what might make Mayor-elect Jones different?
Yes, thank you for that question, Emily. And again, I'm grateful to be here, particularly in this historic moment. As a resident of the St. Louis area, literally for more than 40 years, I believe that the location of this administration will not just be situated south of Delmar. There's been so much conversation and documentation about segregation, basically, in the city of St. Louis. Prior to this administration, particularly in the last couple of administrations, all of the focus has been on South St. Louis, which in essence has left the majority of Black residents out of the benefit of particular policies, out of the focus, out of the budget. North St. Louis has long suffered because of racism and all of the focus being on white residents in the city of St. Louis. And I believe that this win with now Mayor-elect Tishaura Jones is a shift, and the people have hope. When I heard from young people on the ground in North St. Louis particularly, they just talked about the restoration of hope and the possibility that now they might also have a mayor.
Talk about that organizing effort, because I know so often when people are organizing around a candidate, they're also organizing around a set of issues. And some people are in the movement because they love the candidate, and some people are in the movement because they really care about policing, and some people are in the movement because they really care about economic mobility. And there's like a lot of things that bring people into support of something. So I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about how you were involved in the organizing effort around the mayoral election, but also where you see that organizing effort going now that Tishaura Jones is the mayor-elect.
Yeah, and so for our organization, Missouri Faith Voices does not endorse candidates, but we organize with a base of people who are the most impacted by every ism that you can name, the most impacted by economic inequities, the most impacted by racial inequities, and etc., the most impacted by gun violence. And so our organizing efforts were to turn out the vote, particularly in the Black community, in the community where turnout is low, and still was in this election as well, but in the community where people have firsthand experience with what it means to have a city leader that does not focus on their quality of life. And so our organizing looked like listening to people, talking to people about their concerns, about their daily needs, what life was like on their block, in their community, for their families, what they were imagining, what a new St. Louis could look like, what an inclusive St. Louis would look like. And so it involved a lot of listening to those people, a lot of galvanizing, particularly young people, some of the communities north of Del Mar, and having them participate in democracy, in some cases for the very first time. The ways in which we see that in a post-election season is with accountability. On my timeline today, one of the things that I saw, I got to facilitate the 100-day town hall when Prosecutor Wesley Bell was elected in St. Louis County now 3 years ago. And it was an accountability to the community. And so I anticipate the ongoing organizing, particularly for Missouri Faith Voices and other organizations, will be around accountability, around making sure, and I don't think we'll have a problem with, because our mayor is from the people, but making sure that the things that we heard at the doors and on the phones with people in North St. Louis, people who are most impacted, are on the mayor's agenda, particularly around gun violence at this juncture.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because, I mean, obviously there are going to be challenges that the new mayor will be facing when she takes office. And the St. Louis Post-Dispatch editorial board has already raised questions about whether, I'll quote, whether her heavily left-leaning agenda can yield the positive results residents and business investors require. So that editorial board, of course, opposed Jones, but I think that the question is legitimate, which is that St. Louis is currently experiencing its highest homicide rate in 50 years, and her approach to violence is going to be front and center. However, I also know that, policing and incarceration, if it was going to fix violence, probably would have fixed violence at some point in the last 100 years or so. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what you expect her to do to react to violence in the city, and why you expect her approach, if you do expect it to be more effective, why?
Yeah, well, I think this is a good time, to, not just because the numbers are so high, but in this time of dealing with the pandemic. Last week, there was a historic, executive action by President Biden around moving more than $5 million to deal with gun violence. We also have money that has come in from the American Rescue Plan. And so one of the first things on our agenda, in collaboration with other partners, will be to sit down with the mayor and talk about what percentage of that money that came into St. Louis from the American Rescue Plan can be used to literally combat gun violence and the reduction of gun violence. I moved to St. Louis when I was under 8 years old, and I remember a headline that said approximately 273 or 74 people killed the year before. And like I said, I was under 8, but that headline haunts me. And I say that as a reminder that St. Louis didn't get this way just under the last administration or even the one before that. There are decades and decades of neglect, decades and decades of rage from people who have been deprived of basic needs in North St. Louis, particularly. Decades and decades of trauma that has been experienced, particularly by Black people and other people of color. And so one thing I know is that she won't be able to fix it overnight. But I do have hope because she recognizes that it is a problem. She recognizes that it is a public health crisis. And I do believe that her understanding of that crisis, the fact that she has lived in the neighborhoods, in the community where violence has occurred, that she's not removed herself from that, will allow a pathway forward that will be different than that which we've seen over the last few administrations.
So speaking of that different path, Jones has talked a lot about the city's over-reliance on policing and incarceration as a means to deal with social problems and other systemic inequities that communities in St. Louis are facing. I know you talked about every kind of ism in the world, and I think that's really much, we're talking about the intersection of all of those isms and the carceral state. And I know she's spoken before, including with us here at The Appeal, about the importance of exploring alternatives, including alternatives to police. things like civilian first responders. So people who are not police officers trained to respond to low-level crises, things where sort of problem solving and reconciliation are valuable. What steps do you think she needs to take on things like civilian alternative first responders?
I believe there are the program is in place, so to speak, with the people, right? There are grassroots organizations. I'm thinking of Organization for Black Struggle in particularly, and other organizations in the city, leaders who have developed community policing models, a civilian oversight, a kind of committee, and making sure that those organizations and those efforts are resourced versus having all of the money go into law enforcement, because it has been proven to be an ineffective strategy. If all policing were the solution, then we wouldn't be having this conversation, particularly about gun violence reduction. If over-policing was a solution, there would be better relationships in the city of St. Louis and across the country. If that were the case. You know, we went to bed with the news of another police shooting in Minneapolis, and we know that St. Louis is one of the leaders of the packs in police shootings over the last few years. And so I believe that her relationship with the community, her relationship and understanding and knowledge of community organizations will help her and assist her in shaping policy and programming that actually gets to what she has already considered. You know, having more social workers and mental health kind of workers, and even faith leaders, right? Who are trained to escalate in situations, and in some ways, not just for the sake of the community, but also to hold law enforcement accountable will be a pathway. It's going to be really important. The public safety director, Jimmy Edwards, thank God, resigned. And it's going to be real important that the person in that position is a person that is not wanting to maintain the carceral state, but a person that actually wants to help the community to develop more diversion programs, to decrease the number of those incarcerated in facilities. You know, we had now the fourth uprising at the City Injustice Center, and it is telling. It is a language that those who are living there, they're trying to get out. It's a story that they're trying to tell.
I'd love to ask you a question. You mentioned the horrifying news out of Minnesota this morning, and before, you know, as we sort of linger, here you are talking to the media. So I'm going to ask about the role of the media, and what I'm reflecting on is, you know, you're sitting in a city that's poised for great change, and great change is challenging, and obviously the mayor-elect cannot do it all by herself. You're also sitting in a city that's one of the epicenters of the uprisings for change, and for specifically change in, you know, the way we respond to harm. So the question I'm asking is, I noticed this morning, I saw on the internet that the New York Times headline on this Minnesota shooting had changed. The original headline was, "Officer near Minneapolis kills motorist and a crowd confronts the police." And I noticed that they changed that headline to, "Officer near Minneapolis shoots motorist who dies and a crowd confronts the police." So I guess my question for you is, as you embark on this, you know, journey of change with a new mayor, what do you think the media has to do better? How do you think public discourse has to change if we're going to see real results, even for brave public leaders like the mayor-elect?
Yeah, and I think the media can be either an ally or an adversary. And there are media outlets who are certainly adversaries, right? And they shall not be named on this program. And you all have been an ally at the Appeal, so I appreciate that. I think that there has to be a cultural competence around even how headlines are created. My first degree is in journalism. I haven't worked in the field since being the editor of the High paper, though. But I do think, I remember just how we would think long and hard about headlines. And it's not just a matter of grabbing attention. oftentimes when I see headlines, even from allegedly progressive media outlets, the headlines shame the victim. The headlines, traumatize the community that's already experiencing harm, and they're often inaccurate because of the lack of cultural competence. And so I do believe that the media has a role in this moment. I believe that the media has a role in digging into and shedding light on the records of these police departments that are historically and notably really over policing and harming and often killing, particularly Black people. In the state of Missouri, for the last 21 years, in a few months, June 1st, we'll get a report about vehicular stops from the Attorney General's office. That Attorney General's office has been on both sides of the aisle. We get a report that highlights the kind of stops, demographics about Black, white, Asian, Hispanic people who've been stopped in the state of Missouri from every law enforcement department in the state. And all it is a report. When we were in Ferguson, the Department of Justice came and provided us with all of this information around literally over policing. We don't really need any more reports. What we need is accountability. And in as much as media can actually shed light on how these departments, how these bad actors are not held accountable, that also will help those of us who are working on the ground, trying to make a difference. We're trying to make sure. I have a Black son. I have a Black daughter. As a Black woman, my son is a full-grown man, married with children, and it lives out of state, and I'm still really worried. I want to talk to him when he gets home at night. When he visits St. Louis, I am extra nervous because I'm concerned that his Black buff body would be considered a threat. I'm concerned that when they see him, they won't see his brilliance, but they will see a threat. And so I want all of the Black children, Black men, Black women, I want the media, and I want police and law enforcement to treat us as if we were white, report in the way that you would if the victim was a white person, and act accordingly and handle them in a traffic stop the way you would if the victim was white. If that 20-year-old young man outside of Minneapolis on last night who called his mother to ask her where the insurance card was, if he had been white, he would have gotten home last night. When his mother called back, he would not have already been shot and dead. She would have been able to give him what he needed, and he would have gotten home safely. I am convinced of that.
That is a very powerful way to frame that. Thank you for that, Reverend. I appreciate that framing. So speaking of listening to people who the system too often silences, I'm a former public defender, and I love putting the focus on people who are not only marginalized in the free world, but so often silenced by our carceral facilities. So I want to turn to two institutions in St. Louis, the City Justice Center and the Workhouse. The Justice Center, of course, has been home to a number of recent uprisings where incarcerated people have protested the conditions in which they are being kept, incredibly long wait times that have left people sitting in cages, subject to seemingly indefinite detention while they await trial. And keep in mind, for those of you who are blessedly not steeped in the criminal system, these are people who've not been convicted of a crime, who are just waiting for their day in court and are being kept in really, really unspeakable conditions in the City Justice Center. And of course, also, we can talk about the closure of the Workhouse. But I'd love for you to tell us more about what's going on with people who are behind bars and what the mayor-elect has said she will do in response to their concerns.
So, and this is a story that I don't often tell. I have firsthand knowledge about what it means to be in that City Justice Center. My nephew has been there for the last 2.5 years. Not 2.5 months, not 6 months, 2.5 years. I talk to him weekly. when there was the initial uprising, I didn't talk to him for about 10 days and almost lost my mind because I had no way of knowing if there had been retaliation. I had no way of knowing if he was well, if he was okay. And so when I finally talked to him, he was on the other end of the phone crying because he was indeed afraid. He was crying because of the conditions, particularly in a pandemic, and sharing with me how unsafe it was, sharing with me how after the initial uprising, how those who are there were treated, and it is a reminder for me as to why I do this work. It is a reminder to me that even for people who don't have family members who are unfortunate enough to be caught in a system that leaves them to languish 2.5 years without a sense of what is going to happen next. He didn't have bail. So, he has an attorney, not a public defender. It's not that we didn't have the money if he was able to get out. It is just a system that is designed to literally trap people, to actually condition them around all of the elements and the tenets of incarceration. I do believe our mayor, when she says that she will put the resources, the time and energy into actually delving into what is going on in that system, to listen to the stories, to actually make a difference, to change the conditions. Again, I think some of this lies with who the public safety director is and who it's not. Under the last public safety director who dares to now seek a better job, those conditions were maintained. These are humans. These are not people that we get to just throw away in society. Some of them may be guilty of what they are accused of. Some may not. But in America, we're also guaranteed that little called due process. I understand how some things were slowed down during the pandemic. But again, my nephew has been there 2.5 years. This pandemic was declared a year and a month ago. So he was already languishing before that even happened. And I think the public safety director, that person and their role in is going to be crucial. Is going to have to be something, while being a part of law enforcement, is going to have to be someone that is actually deeply invested in the humanity of all St. Louisans. Someone that does not use a human hierarchy to decide that some of St. Louisans don't deserve to have the kind of treatment that others deserve. I do believe our mayor, when she says that she's going to work feverishly to ensure that the will of the people around the workhouse and that it is actually closed.
Well, speaking of what's happening in the world outside of jail walls, I want to talk for a second before we close about evictions. Because, of course, we are still in the midst of a pandemic, and therefore the eviction moratorium in St. Louis has only thus far been extended until May, but people are getting behind on their rent every single day because people are still out of work and people are still paying, all of these additional costs of surviving a pandemic in America. The federal moratorium, of course, lasts until June. But whenever these protections expire, be it May or June, there's going to be an eviction machine in the city that kicks into full effect. And this has already started happening outside of St. Louis City. And many of the people who are just treading water, who are the people you've been speaking about so much in this interview, are going to be really, really at risk of becoming unhoused. So how do you hope to see Mayor-elect Jones address the housing needs of St. Louis residents in the coming months?
I hope that it will involve some deep listening, some imagination around resources. I've been a landlord. I've owned real estate. So I also understand particularly the needs of, if you're a small a landlord with just a few properties or et cetera, your family's trying to eat as well, you're going to have a major economic crisis that will result in a public health crisis if people don't have adequate housing, which is already an issue in St. Louis, right? There's a major issue with the unhoused have been treated in St. Louis. They've been, pushed aside. That was a real sticking point for the last administration. I do think that I'm assuming that there is, again, some resources from the CARES Act, and how might the bridge be bridged between the needs of landlords and the needs families who are doing the best that they can to stay afloat. I think that she's going to have to be, and I'm sure she will be, in collaboration with some social service groups, the Urban League, with religious bodies, with churches and other charitable organizations that can help people get back to where they need to be so that they might be able to sustain themselves. But affordable and good affordable housing, the kind of housing that everyone would want their loved ones to live in, is an issue in the city of St. Louis. And that is something that's going to take more than a month, more than a couple of months to deal with. Our mayor-elect has her hands full. She certainly has the gifts, the graces, and the intellect to be able to work through these things. But also, in fairness to her, none of these things, even those things that are urgent, will present human crises, are going to be solved in the first 30, 40, or even year of her administration.
Reverend Gould, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for talking through this incredible array of issues. I have to say, I'm so impressed by the amount of your experience that has been folded in with great relevance to this conversation. So thank you for bringing your perspective and all of your work onto this show. It's been really a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you all for your competent reporting. It means a lot in this season.
We'll do our best to keep up the competent reporting. We've just heard from Reverend Gould all about the new mayor-elect of St. Louis, Tishaura Jones, who will be taking the helm as St. Louis's first Black woman mayor. A very exciting turn in a time when the conversation really has focused on what it means to listen to all residents. Who do our elected officials represent? Do they represent some of us? Do they represent powerful interests? Do they represent the biggest donors? Do they represent corporate entities, or do they represent everyone, including everyone I just listed, but also folks who've been traditionally marginalized and silenced and shut out of the system, as the Reverend said, subject to all of these different isms? We're holding this conversation in a moment that is, yet again, in just the hours after, or in the conversation surrounding yet another killing by police in Minnesota. We are having this conversation in a moment when the Reverend's own nephew is locked behind jail walls and has been there for over 2 years. Imagine, a year before the pandemic, waiting for his day in court. We're having this conversation in the shadow of a massive eviction moratorium. It's about to give way in the summer, subjecting millions of Americans possibly to becoming unhoused. So these conversations aren't just interesting, they are essential. They are life and death for so many people who voted in this election and want to have their voices heard. All of these conversations that come down to who will be protected from the harms of our modern world, from the harms of the pandemic, from the harms of poverty or the carceral state, and who will not be heard. I think our biggest takeaway at the end was when Reverend Gould said that we've got to give this mayor time. Mayor-elect is going to need a lot of time to deal with the incredible complexity of intersecting issues that she will face if she does truly seek to represent all the people of St. Louis. This has been another episode of The Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvan Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.